Hi everyone, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you all. If you haven't met me before, I'm HaloITSM's product manager, Jason. Part of my responsibility looks after the Technology Alliance partnership with Lansweeper. And fortunately today, we've got Thomas joining us. He's a director of product strategy at Lansweeper. He'll be able to allow us understanding what data we can leverage to support enterprise-wide vulnerability and service management. From that data, what we can get into Halo and what we can do into data-driven approach service management in terms of from a security point of view. Um, Thanks, Thomas, for joining us.
No worries at all. Thanks for having me.
So today, I understand we're looking a little bit towards the security side of things. Do you mind kicking us off and going through that with us and showing us or educating us what's available from the Lansweeper platform and allow us to do some actionable insights, etc.
Yeah, perfect. Let me try and share my screen. Just give me 1 second. And then if I go full screen, are you seeing my slides?
I am. Thank you.
Cool.
It's a bit great. Yep, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. I didn't do anything, by the way. I just shared my slides. Don't say thank you.
No problem. And for those who, before Thomas starts as well, for those who are aware, we also have a Q&A session at the end as well. But feel free to ask any questions along the way. I'll be monitoring the chat while Thomas presenting. So the more the merrier. Keep them coming. And there you go. I'll leave the stage to you, Thomas.
Cheers, Jason. So, hey everybody, my name is Thomas, and as Jason says, I run product strategy at Lansweeper. And today, what I want to talk about is a concept that we call technology asset intelligence. Um, but more importantly, not just the definition of technology asset intelligence, but what this really enables you to be able to do when we start to think about various different use cases, but specifically across security and service management. So, what I aim to do is explore about kind of the data that you already have across like your estate, and then how you can turn that into something much more powerful, and then something that can help you do things like prioritize better, resolve things faster, and then ultimately make smarter decisions across the various different functions within the business. Now, my my goal here isn't to show off a product. Yes, I work at Lansweeper, but my aim isn't to kind of start taking you through exactly all of the different screens and how Lansweeper works, because then it would just be a sales pitch. My aim here is to show you a path like forward through the use of data. And really important is about how we can enable not just an IT team or not just a security team, but all different teams across the business to kind of cut through all of the noise that data provides, like bridge silos between the teams and to get to fixing things that actually matter. So with that in mind, and you'll see there's kind of a theme throughout the presentation. It's all like posed as questions. So with that in mind, like with all of the technology that we have today and all of the different tools and products, etc., at our disposal, why is it still so hard to fix the things that matter? And it's a great question because a lot of us have spent a lot of time and money and effort gathering all of these tools together. We all have different tools like discovery tools, CMDB, ticketing platforms, dashboards, and we've got lots of security tools with security alerts coming out of our ears, right? And yet we're still really slow to respond in some cases. We misroute incidents, we delay patching, we approve changes without really fully understanding the downstream impact of things. Now you'll hear this often, security teams are overwhelmed with their alerts. They can't confidently prioritize because they don't know, simple questions like which assets are actually exposed or which ones are in use or which ones are like business critical. Then you've got your service teams that face, I guess the best way to describe it is like constant friction. So you've got delays and the misrouting that I've mentioned, and I'll continue to mention the unclear ownership. They ultimately spend hours tracking down foundational like elements, like the basics, like who owns this system and is this system up to date and what's this system like onwardly connected to. And at the core, right, this is a shared problem. We don't have enough context. We'll talk about context a bunch, but we have data, but we don't have the understanding. We have the tools, but we don't have the coordination between them. And that's what this is like really about. If we take like a broader view for a second, because the problems that we're dealing with specifically like in IT and security, it's not that they're just more complex today, it's that they're becoming a lot more distributed. So we have different teams all part of the kind of response, and they're all being pulled in different directions. You've got your finance teams who are under pressure for things like improving return on investment or reducing like overall spend. You've got your IT teams that are trying to optimize performance and keep like everything running. And then you've got your security teams that are trying to chase down the threats. But then on top of all of those, you've then got the proliferation of technology. You've got your cloud, your SaaS, your IoT, the increase a few years ago of remote working. The sprawl is like exponentially increasing. And what makes it harder is that nobody really knows if what they're doing is actually helping everybody else, whether it's downstream, upstream, across the side stream, right? You've got security that does something, but does IT know about it? You've got IT that maybe decommissions a server and is the CMDB updated? You've got a patch that gets pushed, but do we even know if the asset is still in use? Without the kind of shared visibility and that kind of context that I spoke about before, we're all operating in isolation. That effort doesn't translate to outcomes, and this is where like problems start to show themselves. You've got the misaligned priorities, you've got incomplete data, you've got duplicate work, and it all drives towards this like slow reactive decision making. And this fragmentation is one of the biggest costs when we start to think about enterprise IT. And it's exactly what technology asset intelligence has been designed to address. So I've mentioned the word a bunch. It's a word that everybody will be hearing more and more due to the kind of increase of AI usage throughout business. But what do I mean by context? Like what happens when context is missing? Now, nearly every business is like facing and dealing with, the misrouted tickets, the delayed patching, the failed changes, the slow audits. They all trace back to missing context. It's not that we lack visibility anymore. We lack that shared, reliable understanding of the environment as a whole. So this is the part of every presentation where someone shows a bunch of scary numbers from Gartner and then tells you that bad data is costing the global economy like trillions and trillions of dollars. And yes, honestly, that's true, right? But let's be honest, none of us on this call need research to understand that our asset data is a mess because we've all lived it. We've all seen that ticket that's looped through 3 teams because no one knows who owns a system. We've had a vulnerability that sits untouched because it's probably on a decommissioned asset, but no one's willing to kind of make a bet. We've all approved changes, hoping that a dependency doesn't break because the CMDB is more aspirational than it is accurate. And this then becomes the cost, right? Slower fix, lower trust, duplication of work, and teams like second guessing their own data. And it's not just that we're missing the context, right? It's that we're actually normalizing working around that missing context. You've got those dirty shadow spreadsheets and team wikis and like the side channel chats that you have with people, all because the official kind of data stream in the business can't really be relied upon. And that then creates a fragility around the entire operation. Things still get done, obviously, but it's incredibly like effort heavy and inconsistent and most of the time reactive. So if we get like more concrete, like with a few like simple examples, these will be situations that you'll have all experienced, probably even this morning in some cases. Like your misrouted ticket, the user reports the issue, but the asset record that's attached to it is out of date. That ticket gets passed to the desktop support team, to the infrastructure team, to the apps team, and then only after the 3 handoffs does it reach the right people. You've then got your vulnerabilities that you get a high CVE one morning. Nobody even knows if that CVE on that asset, if that asset is like still alive or who owns that asset. So it gets marked as a low priority or no priority at all and disappears into that like backlog limbo that we all have. The changes that go wrong, a patch is deployed or a system's decommissioned, and then suddenly downstream some critical like dependency or system like breaks. And the reason why is because we have no visibility of the dependencies between like the assets. And then finally, you got like the audit failure, which arguably is like one of the most painstaking experiences that anybody has to go through. And I can talk from experience of this. You know, the compliance team ask you for a list of all of the assets that handle sensitive data or everything that is nearing its end of life. And what you're able to collect in the period of time that you've been given is a partial like list in a spreadsheet that is missing like half of the picture, and then you cry yourself to sleep having to build the rest of the spreadsheet manually. None of these are like surprising, right? They're all predictable. They're all things that come from fragmented systems with untrusted data. And while each of them on their own, you know, we may think of as, you know, inconsequential, the compound effect over time is massive, both from like operational perspective and also from a kind of financial perspective as well. And something that a lot of people don't think about is the cultural aspect as well too. Like if you have all of this kind of stuff happening all of the time, nobody is going to want to work here anymore because it becomes a pain. So how do we go about fixing this? A lot of people think it's about the tools that you use, and you may have like many tools already. So you ask yourself, well, what about all of these existing tools that I've got, right? And look, you probably do have a lot of tools. Everybody does. You'll have your CMDB and your vulnerability scanner and your endpoint protection and obviously your ITSM, right? And again, those dirty spreadsheets that are doing some crazy calculations in the background that kind of your whole business seems to run on. But despite all of those things, you still have these problems that I'm talking about because each of the tools that you've got have been built for a specific use case. It sees the environment through its like own lens, and then it's making assumptions based upon that lens that it has. And this becomes like a huge problem because the inherent trust that we have in these tools that we pay a lot of money for is then tested on things that are that really matter. So I showed this slide before, but like with a slightly different view. You know, every major challenge that we face, whether it's ransomware, whether it's regulatory compliance or performance optimization or insider threats, right? They have one or many different tools that are marketed for that particular solution. Every kind of space is a crowded market today. And these tools in isolation often do a pretty good job. You're not going to hear me like slagging off any product unless it deserves it, because in isolation they do a pretty good job at like dealing with the one thing that they've been created for. But that's the problem. You have a dozen different platforms that have been making decisions independently, each with their own view of, you know, what an asset is, what context like really matters, and then what good enough for their use case actually means. And that fragmentation leads to various different teams pulling in various different directions. And, you know, a fix in one side of the house may break assumptions on the other side of the house. Nobody has like a complete picture. And as a result, nobody's able to act with the full confidence that they need. So the reality that we live in is this, that it isn't the case of we don't have enough tools. We have plenty. In fact, we probably have too many. And on the one side, you've got these kind of suite players, those bigger platforms that try and cover off, you know, like a broad set of capabilities under one roof. But even, you know, those vendors, they're focused on their own ecosystem, their own way of like seeing the world. They're not like neutral per se. They've been built for their use cases and their idea of what good enough is. And then you've got the huge like wave of point solutions too, each that are laser focused with, you know, one problem that they're trying to solve, whether it be vulnerability scanning or patch automation or license compliance, whatever that one thing might be. And each and every one of those tools has its own definition of what an asset is. It collects the data that it needs and nothing more. And then it uses its own methods and context and assumptions and rarely shares that outside of its own bubble. And when it does, it's focused on sharing like one to one and not one to all. So what you're then left with is a stack that looks complete, but in practice it doesn't agree on anything. And that results in a conflicting truth, these data silos that I talked about before, and then the teams. And like I keep drawing back to like the separate teams because I think that this is really important. You get asked all the time, how do you bring teams together? How do you collaborate more? If your teams are interpreting like through data that has discrepancies, instead of aligning on, insights that are aligned in one place with one like mind, you're never going to be able to bring these people together. So, and for those of you who have known the Lansweeper of old, you may then be sat there thinking, so are you telling me that the challenge isn't visibility? It's not that we can't see things anymore, right? Like we're now in the part of the world where seeing things is, I wouldn't say straightforward, but if you have all of these different products and tools, like seeing things like across the board is relatively straightforward. The problem is that we don't have that kind of understanding across what we can see to be able to act with confidence. That's the problem, because visibility isn't the same as intelligence. We don't need more tools showing us more data. We need that alignment. We need that context. We need something that helps us move from kind of raw input, raw data into real decision making, and that's the shift that asset intelligence provides. So most environments, and if you kind of think about your own environment, you'll see some of the things here that you have, right? You've got the usual suspects. You've got your vulnerability scanners, your CMDB, your ITSM, endpoint protection, the spreadsheets, the workflow automation, scheduled tasks, the works. You've got all of these things that are running continuously. And each of these things gives you like a form of visibility, but it's specific for their use case, like I mentioned before. And then, they'll have their own definitions and limitations and assumptions. What's missing is this kind of way of bringing together these fragmented like visibilities, let's call them, and then turning them into something that is usable, something that helps you to prioritize or understand ownership or assess risk or take action in a much more like confident manner. That's what technology asset intelligence is all about. It's that shift from seeing something to understanding why or what matters about that thing. And to clarify, because after I created this slide, I realized that maybe it's slightly misleading. Technology asset intelligence isn't just about pulling everybody else's view of your environment together. The first and most important thing is building like a purpose-built understanding of the environment first, and then layering on top of that all of the things that everything else like knows about it, normalizing it, enriching it, getting rid of the conflicts and all of the misunderstandings that might be because one system is configured in a slightly different way than the other, to then build that overall kind of context that can be consumed. But we'll talk about where that gets consumed in a moment. So fine, what then is the definition? This is how we define technology asset intelligence. At its core, it's about taking that raw data from kind of physical, virtual, hardware, software, users, whatever data that is available within the environment, and then transforming it into actionable insights. It's not just about lists of assets anymore, right? It's not just about like scanning for a vulnerability, but it's about understanding the things that are there, where it matters, why it matters, who owns that thing, what it's exposed to, how it connects to other parts of the business. It's that context that helps us like build more clarity so that we can move from kind of the endless tickets and alerts to kind of confident, informed decisions. And the power of this isn't just limited to, like one use case. It kind of helps us across the board. So you've got your incident resolution and change, obviously, but then like patch prioritization, compliance assurance, and then even things like strategic planning and cost management as well. The important thing is that it's not about the asset list. For those of you who know Lansweeper and have been a customer of Lansweeper maybe for many years, it's what Lansweeper's been very good at, inventory. But inventory alone and visibility alone, as I said before, is no longer enough. It's less about the asset list and more about the asset story. And that story needs to be complete and consistent and trustable. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. Now, this is what it all like drives down to. Discovery tells you like what's out there, and context tells you why it matters. Discovery is foundational. Again, I mentioned it before, you can't secure or manage or support what you don't know about. But what I'm saying now is that that isn't in and of itself enough anymore. You need to know, is it a critical asset? Is it exposed? Is it in use? Who owns it? What services depend on that particular thing? That's what context brings. And when you then combine those two things together, complete discovery with like meaningful context, that's when you unlock intelligence. That's when these teams can act much more quicker. They can prioritize things much more confidently, and then they can support each other across all of the various silos within the organization. So let's talk about it practically. How can you move from just like having this into actually using it across various use cases? And today, like as Jason said, I'm going to focus a little bit on security, and I'll talk briefly about service management as well. We talked about the problem, fragmented tool, siloed data, lack of context. We've talked about the shift from visibility to intelligence. So how does it actually help? Now, as an organization, we spend quite a lot of time like focusing on security. It's kind of one of the core use cases that Lansweeper is used for. And the reason for that is because security is where context really does matter. It's where prioritization decisions are able to like lead to, a real world consequence, especially depending on what type of business you are. If you are part of like critical national infrastructure and you don't prioritize something in the right way, then there are much bigger downstream impacts than, other types of organizations, let's say. So let me like talk through like how asset intelligence can make a difference in vulnerability management. When people think about vulnerability management and kind of prioritization in general, they think about CVSS scores. If you've worked in this space, you'll know about CVSS. But for those of you who potentially don't, CVSS stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It is I guess, a consistent way in which you can rate vulnerabilities based on technical risk. Now, if you have worked in this space, you'll know that there are downfalls to CVSS, that there's limitations, and you can sometimes find that they don't provide you with the context that is required to be able to make the best decisions. So some reasons for that, right? So number one is that the scores are often assigned at the point in which a vulnerability is disclosed, but not then updated once additional information and context is provided. So as an example, if I identify a vulnerability today and then it kind of gets released like publicly, usually within a few days, that'll be analyzed. If I haven't already kind of created my own CVSS score, CVSS score will be assigned. And then that CVSS score very typically is the score of that vulnerability, regardless of if, a month down the line, 2 months down the line, 3 months down the line, something different happens. Now, that score is created using what I like to call like a clean room methodology, or like a clean room model. It talks about like how hard is it to like build a proof of concept and to use that proof of concept or exploit against people or against the business, not whether or not there is stuff actually happening at that time, especially if things change. And the context that's used to generate that score is usually private. I'm sure, again, for those of you who like work in this space, you'll see a vulnerability at some point and you'll see that it's calculated as like a CVSS 10, which is like the highest it can be. But when you read all of the information about that particular vulnerability, it's like, yeah, okay, it's a serious vulnerability, but I don't quite understand why it's a 10. And that's because the kind of core information has been kept private between the researcher who identified the vulnerability in the first instance and the vendor. So it's really then trusting on private conversations as opposed to anything that you yourself know. Now, there are obviously ways in which you can make CVSS better. They have this concept of temporal and environmental metrics where you can add parts of like calculations to the mix that take into account things in your environment and compensating controls and stuff like that. You also have EPSS, exploit predictability scoring system, which is predicting the likelihood of this being exploited in the wild within the next month. There are countless different threat intelligence feeds that you could use, like indicators of compromise on, etc. But none of it has been designed or is like integratable in a clean and consistent way. I've seen organizations that have all of the best intentions of including like the environmental and temporal metrics as part of CVSS to make it more customizable. But the problem is that at scale, and when I say at scale, previous to working at Lansweeper, I ran a startup, and before that, I worked at IBM, where I ran the vulnerability management and offensive cybersecurity team. And when we were scanning organizations with Qualys was the vulnerability scanner that we used at the time, on average, we were finding somewhere in the region of about 1.7 million vulnerabilities every single time we scanned. So when I talk about at scale, I'm talking, thousands of vulnerabilities, potentially millions of vulnerabilities. being able to add that kind of context in is incredibly difficult. So let's take an example of where it all falls down. This example is from a vulnerability back in 2021. I believe it's the printer spool of vulnerability. And you can see at the time in which it was first disclosed, so on the 3rd of July, there were 4 known ways of exploiting that vulnerability. Now, the column on the right-hand side, CVSS, that has been left blank because it hasn't been analyzed yet. No CVSS score has been made available. So there is no uniform approach to saying that this is the risk. Obviously, vulnerability scanners will have assigned their own risk scores, etc. But from a CVSS perspective, which by default is the way that most organizations are prioritizing, there was no way to prioritize that. Then on the 7th of July, they released the CVSS score and it was an 8.8. But look at the middle column. Over the space of a few weeks, more and more exploits became available for that particular vulnerability. But the risk never changed. Now, the reason more exploits became available is because potentially the exploits that were available to begin with only worked in, a particular instance, it was in a contrived way. And then as it became weaponized and available in the Metasploit framework, which is an exploit framework, that then enabled you to do it in another way. But then maybe it didn't work on, Windows 10. So there needed to be an exploit for Windows 10. And maybe it didn't allow for particular actions to occur post exploitation. So then another exploit gets created. All of these changes and all of these new ways of thinking about the vulnerability and ways of exploiting the vulnerability have had no impact in that particular score. So another example would be WannaCry. So WannaCry was a malware that was propagated with the use of a vulnerability which was identified and disclosed 6 months prior. I mean, arguably it was identified way before that because it was leaked through, from the government, but that's a totally different story. We don't need to talk about that right now. But the point I'm trying to make is that it was identified, it was a vulnerability, it was a malware that utilized the vulnerability that was disclosed 6 months prior. And if you looked at the severity of that particular vulnerability that allowed the propagation of the WannaCry malware, it wasn't a CVSS 10. It was a 9.8 maybe, or maybe even lower. So if you then go back to the example that I gave where on average the customers that I worked with before had 1.7 million vulnerabilities, then you're in this situation whereby you have lots and lots of CVSS 10s before you even get to the vulnerability that arguably is one of the most prolific vulnerabilities that has ever existed across the world because of the impact that it had. But that hasn't changed the severity of the score. So if we're relying only on CVSS, how long would it take for an organization to figure out that this vulnerability exists in their backlog? And more importantly, do we know if this vulnerability is impacting an exposed asset, a business critical system? How do we even know? That's where asset intelligence makes the difference. So on the left here, you've got what would traditionally come from kind of your vulnerability scanner. So your vulnerability risk scoring, let's call it. Not everybody does a score, but let's just say score. So that includes exploit activity, behavior in the wild of particular threat actors, threat intelligence feed. There's a big long list of different data points that can be provided, and that helps to give a sense of how dangerous a vulnerability can be. But on the right, you have asset intelligence. This is where you learn if the vulnerability actually matters to you and your environment. Is that asset business critical? Is it end of life or end of support? Is it exposed? Does it store sensitive data? And more importantly, is this asset even still in use? Do we need to be spending a boatload of time dealing with this, or should we have just decommissioned the asset when we decided that we were going to? Now, just a kind of a quick footnote here. Again, just from a Lansweeper perspective, some of the insights on the left actually can also start in the asset intelligence world too. So at Lansweeper, we do what we call correlation of vulnerabilities, where we take vulnerabilities that are known and the asset information that we have, including all of the software and stuff you have installed, and then basically try to correlate where there are potential vulnerabilities. To ultimately, the reason we do that is to proactively flag vulnerable assets prior to a vulnerability scanner doing it, because sometimes it can take time or you can only do it in a certain window. And it basically gives your team a heads up that something may be coming a little bit further down the line, or you can use that as a way to then action response. But let's just assume like that you're taking your vulnerability data from your vulnerability scanner, your asset data from your asset intelligence provider, and you're bringing them together. And when you bring them together, you get something much more useful than just here's the vulnerability risk and here's your asset context. You get to the asset risk. It helps you confidently answer that question of which asset poses the greatest risk to our organization right now. Not in theory, not in the backlog, but right this second, like what is the most at risk asset that we have? And that's how we go from noise to action when we start to think about how you can utilize asset intelligence in function of vulnerability management. So that there is technology. That there is vulnerability management. Let's talk about like the service side of the house now, right? Again, I've talked about tickets being misrouted, incident escalations like being completely wrong or unnecessary, and changes being approved that shouldn't be approved. All of this type of stuff. And just like in security, the context is what's missing. You know, what systems are affected, understanding who owns them, viewing kind of configuration and usage of like particular devices, ultimately helping you to resolve the issues faster. And what we're aiming for is like first contact fix, right? That's what we should all be trying to push towards. So, you know, there are two ways to view this. The first is enriching and providing enrichment to the work that you already have on your plate. So you already have incidents, you already have changes that are planned, you already have compliance actions that need to be dealt with. Firstly, it's about providing that real context into your tickets. It's about, you know, providing at the point that it's necessary, like the device details, the configurations, the ownership, the user linkage, so that you know your service desk agents basically don't have to waste their time investigating. All of the information is there at their fingertips. They're able to make those decisions on that first touch and not on the third escalation, like we talked about earlier. We then have to deal with the thought process of like when a ticket comes in, being able to immediately understand like the necessary additional information that may or may not help you, to be totally honest, but that give you additional context around whether or not this is even more of a risk than initially we first thought. So if you get like vulnerabilities and then being able to correlate alongside that whether or not it's a vulnerability in a piece of software that's like end of life, or if you're missing encryption, if it's like a data problem, or if it's tied to like a different vulnerability or a different part of the environment as well, or is this particular asset part of the compliance scope? That then helps you move from just kind of generic like response paths into, you know, much more specialized response paths. I gave a talk about a month or so back at SITS where I talked about how security embedded into service management and into your ticket process like helps you make decisions, and it's essentially the same thing here. And then finally you've got your lower ops costs. So you know, the operational stuff that maybe we don't think about as we're doing it, but switching between different tools and different contexts and digging through like old spreadsheets and, you know, old records to kind of find information together and bring information together, sorry, that takes time. You need the information where the work is happening, inside the workflows, inside the tickets. It's not about asking teams to change the way that they work, right? That isn't what we want to do. But we want to make sure that they are ready and they have the right data at the moment that they need it. So if that's like providing enrichment to existing work that you've got, what about the inverse? What about actually helping it to identify new work? So this is one of those slides that I mentioned at the beginning that is quite specific to Lansweeper. This is a capability that we've built called HiveMind, and it's something that we've been working on now for about, I'd say about 2 years. And the way that it works is we anonymize and aggregate all of those contexts together across environments to basically generate what we call collective intelligence. It's essentially insights that help you do things like benchmark performance or identify gaps or uncover work that perhaps you should be doing, but you didn't realize it was work that you were missing. We're starting with security. So security is where HiveMind has like kind of come into its own. And
Oh, I've got.
so no, it's where where we've started to kind of like bring HiveMind into play. And it lets you answer questions such as what vulnerabilities have others already fixed that we haven't fixed yet, and it's how did they then go about fixing that. So not just here's a problem, but actually this is like the piece of software that they installed, or the update that they installed in order to get rid of this particular vulnerability, and the fact that it actually brought more vulnerabilities or less vulnerabilities to the mix at that time. And then it also provides like benchmarking to show where you're potentially behind the curve against others in like the same industry or within the same country or with those of a similar tech stack to you. And this is like all based on real world behavior. It's not like hypothetical best practice, right? And like I say, this is a security capability for us right now. But like I genuinely believe that it belongs in this conversation when we talk about service management, because it helps teams to be much more proactive, to make those smarter decisions that we all want to make, and then align like effort with actual like risk and actual things that people are doing to resolve risk. And I don't just mean risk in terms of security now. I'm talking about, there's risk in everything that we do. Licensing is a risk, depending on like how you go about licensing, or whether or not you're about to come to the end of a license period and you haven't started the process of, relicensing. There's lots of different ways in which you can formulate a view on risk. So we're already, yeah, sorry, go.
No, sorry. I was just wondering, all these data with so much information, so with context available for us, surely there's more to expand on more the security as well. Just seeing if you got any insights onto that, and I think it'll be beneficial for people, especially the audience here who's looking to more of a ESM side of things.
Yeah, no, totally. So as I've said, like this isn't we're not just focused on security specific data, right? We focus on data across many different use cases like operational efficiency, life cycle, and like planning and cost and all of that type of thing. So to give you an idea, like what we want to do is provide these insights across the board. And one of the things that we're looking into at the moment is the requirement to adopt Windows 11 over Windows 10 because of end of life, end of support. So it's not just about saying, right, you know that you need to upgrade to Windows 11. It's about saying, okay, well, you're currently this percentage of the way through your migration. But then it's like, how do you then compare to others that are like you? Well, you're currently at 60% of adoption of Windows 11, whereas another organization similar to you might be at 70%. But then it's like, okay, the reason we haven't gone any further is because it's not as simple for us because our hardware doesn't support Windows 11. Okay, perfect. Well, in the situation that other people have been in, and you like this, where they've had to go off and purchase new hardware, what have they gone off and purchased? And then, depending on the information that's provided into Lansweeper with regards to cost and the POs, etc., we can then start to give insights into relative cost of upgrade. So that's like where we want to take HiveMind. We want to take HiveMind into a place that all of the kind of actions companies are taking, how are they going about doing that, so that we can learn collectively from successes and failures of others to basically make IT as a whole like better for an organization. Does that answer your question, Jason?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I guess it's more. Actually, I think it actually tailors to a series of webinars we're doing Halo's doing with Lansweeper with more use cases coming up. So thanks for that explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, no, no worries. So the question then is, where does the data belong? Um, this is like a really important thing to cover off because, once we've got that context and that intelligence and that prioritization, we need to decide where it lives. What I can tell you is that it doesn't just belong in like a nice, shiny new dashboard that you can build. Where it does belong is in the tools that your teams are already using. But it isn't just about like pushing the data into those tools because technology asset intelligence plays this kind of distinct role where we collect the data from the environment and we build like our own context independently first and without relying on the other systems to get it right. But we need to aggregate all of this together and feed the insights in, and not just the raw data. It's not about replicating data everywhere, it's about augmenting the data that already exists. So like making your CMDB more accurate is something, right? Or making it so that your SIM is more informed, or that your ITSM like workflows are much more powerful and useful. So yeah, the data should flow back into the ecosystem for sure, but only after it's been kind of transformed into something that's much more trustworthy and like actionable than just the raw data. So like if we go back to this image as I've slightly changed, like on the left, you've got your existing stack, your good tools, but each with that isolation that we talked about, with that siloed visibility. And then in the center, we've got that kind of technology asset intelligence layer. That's where the enrichment happens, the normalization, the context is layered in, conflicts are then gone off and resolved. But we're not just consolidating it into here, like this is the clarification layer, which then on the right-hand side, we push back into the tools with that kind of consistent, reliable insights. That's the key shift. It's not about giving the tools more data. It's about giving them better context so that they can prioritize, triage, automate, report much more effectively. Because, if you're relying on your patch management tool to determine business criticality, you're asking it to do a job that it was never built for. And you need to have a unified view of criticality. So that's where it lives in that intelligence layer, pushed out to everywhere that needs it. That's why intelligence matters, because it's not about feeding the systems, it's about elevating them all. And that's the outcome that we're driving for, right? You've got all of your teams, whether it's security, IT, finance, whoever, all responsible for individual outcomes, but they're all touching that same estate. And that's like the problem because they each have their own view today of what those assets are, why they matter, what needs to be done with them. And technology asset intelligence becomes that kind of shared language between them all that they can all align around because, it's not about just providing a data source. It's about trying to make this almost like a decision support layer across all of the disciplines that you have within your company, all of the different teams. It connects security with your exposure and risk, IT with like ownership and like service relevance, finance with life cycle and cost impact. It's that common foundation that they all need. Whether you're talking about patching a vulnerability or retiring service or even like I guess planning next year's budget. Because without that shared context, that's where the friction comes that I talked about right at the start. And then finally, as I said, I've got a couple of slides at the end that talk to Lansweeper. This is exactly what Lansweeper does. Lansweeper is all about giving you the visibility, the context, the intelligence that you need to understand your environment, not just the list of assets, but a living kind of risk-aware, business-aligned like ecosystem. We don't just help you see what's there. We help you in understanding like why it matters, and we make that intelligence available where you need it so that you can act faster and align teams and deliver the outcomes that I've spoken about. So it's built to handle any type of technology, whether it's IT, OT. We count users as like technology as well, hardware, software, whatever, across any of the kind of locations that you have, whether it's in the cloud, on-prem. And then we translate that into intelligence from kind of security and compliance, operational efficiency and planning, utilizing the crowdsourcing that I talked about before. And then we make that intelligence like useful and usable in the platforms that you already rely upon. Whether it's Halo or Splunk or Sentinel or even your own systems that you have through API connectivity. So whether you're managing like a vulnerability or resolving incidents or planning updates or just like so many of our customers trying to kind of make sense of a messy estate, Lansweeper is designed to help you do it in a better way, not by replacing your tools, but by making them smarter. And I like to call this the SMAC framework. That isn't the official name of it's not even a framework, if I'm totally honest. I don't know why these letters are bolded at the beginning, but yeah, I call it the SMAC framework. But this ultimately is the best way of describing what Lansweeper, the Lansweeper platform does. Helps you discover every asset that you've got, all of the details, no blind spots, and then organize like intuitively all of the different layers of information that we have together and normalize it so that we understand things like accurate ownership and the life cycle state. And then we help you to prioritize based on risk and impact and usage of assets, etc., so that you can then automate, trigger workflows, dates, remediations, whatever it may be that you as a team or an individual within a team is responsible for. And then finally connect it, right? Push that intelligence into the tools that you already rely upon. Because whether you're in security, service, strategy, whatever team you're in, better asset intelligence means better decision making. it gives you that clarity to kind of reduce the noise, so to speak. And let's, again, coming back to the teams, lets your teams work and focus on the work that matters the most. So that is everything that I wanted to share. We've gone through technology asset intelligence, what it means, not just about visibility, but context that helps you kind of like act with confidence. We've talked about how that supports vulnerability management. We talked about service delivery, um, broader like, kind of like operational alignment, how it fits into the systems and workflows that you already use. That's important. Um, I hope that it's helped. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. But I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thanks, Thomas. That was very, very useful. For our HaloITSM customers, I'll just sort of go overview and sort of cover up of how that can be beneficial, how that give an overview of how that relates to ourselves. Um, Now I think what Thomas has mentioned there really is now having the data is no longer good enough. It's about having good data. It's about turning those data into information to allow us to do these actions in Halo and to do these data-driven approach and processes. Now, I understand that security management perhaps not might not be the specific area for us to focus on, but it's just one of the use case and one of the areas that we can look at and have a solutions at, just based on the data that we're getting. The data, the technology, data intelligence is where this stems from. And security, like I said today, like Thomas has showcased today, vulnerability management is typically just an area that we start off with. For those who are interested, we're going to host a series of these webinars and go through these different use cases and different solutions that can cater and that you can incorporate into your Halo platform, where we can provide a joint solution for your enterprise services. Now, I see there's a few questions on the chat. Um, I've got the first few that from Faisal. Faisal, correct me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Um, I'd also like to answer this live as well, so just to share with everyone, to understand it a little bit better. When Lansweeper is purchased with Halo is under the line item called Halo Asset Discovery. Essentially is a cloud integration with Halo that's also included in your professional services. So now, this webinar today is focused on the use cases and what Lansweeper can enhance what we do in Halo. So at the moment, there isn't necessarily a demonstration, but if you want to have a demonstration, feel free to reach out to your customer success manager or, like you said, the consultant that you're working with, and they'll be able to provide a brief overview of the Lansweeper product. Um, and I've also double checked that the Lansweeper for your account is also an existing license that's been secured. It's something that's included in your professional services. So there's nothing that needs to be purchased additionally. I have got one from George Walker. Thomas, do you want to go for that?
Yeah. So the question is, do companies want to share their personal business information, and would it be anonymized? Take the Windows 11 migration as an example. So, George, I believe that you're talking about what I spoke with regards to HiveMind and the kind of collective intelligence. So, the way that HiveMind works, without getting into like the entire like infrastructure, is when we take the kind of the data, that data is anonymized at the point in which it kind of is like taken and put into this data lake that we have. So there is no kind of connection back to the individual like companies when we start to bring the data together and like aggregate that data together. The only things that we're doing which are, I say, identifiable not against the company but like identifiable from a, I guess, demographic perspective, is like we're marking how large that organization is, the number of assets that they have, where in the world they're based, that type of thing. Because what we found out when we started building this was customers like the idea of being able to benchmark themselves or understand how they compare to other companies across, you know, the world. But what they really care about is understanding where they kind of benchmark against companies that are similar to them. So yes, the data is anonymized. And again, for any Lansweeper customers that are on this call potentially, HiveMind is also, you're able to opt out of HiveMind too. So if you opt out of HiveMind, your data isn't part of like the anonymous aggregated like data lake. But at the same time, you're unable to kind of get the insights because we're not able to include your data into that data lake, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Thomas. Right, we got our next one. How can we ensure the asset data we're collecting is reliable and accurate enough to drive both service management and security decisions?
It's a good question, because for a long time we've moved away. For a long time it's always been about discovery, as I said, and like visibility. And then you've had like companies like Lansweeper, hands up, like completely, that have basically been trying to compete against themselves to say that they're the best in the world at discovery. Um, the fact of the matter is, and this kind of first started to rear its head when there was almost like a, let's call it like a side or a spin-off of Discovery, which was known as, it's not talked about so much anymore, cyber asset attack surface management. When that started to become a market and Gartner started talking about it, what they started to talk to was this idea that actually visibility needs to come from the integration of lots of different things together. And what we started to notice was that a lot of companies started to bring data together, but the data, because of the various different forms that it has, like depending on what tool or like platform you're looking at it in, it all is slightly different. So like reconciling all of that data together then becomes the problem. So that's why like we've like moved into this world of like technology asset intelligence, because yes, we believe that we're the best at discovery, right? Like first and foremost. We've been at it now for I think 21 years, and we've built a platform that can discover things really well. But we also know that there are things that we miss, and that isn't because we miss them because you know our discovery sometimes has a bug or something, let's say, but it's because we may not even be in that environment to scan that environment. But your vulnerability scanner might have the ability to scan everywhere because of the way that it was configured, and that particular team having all of the right political like people in the room to be able to get that approved. So in answer to your question, how do we make sure that we're collecting like the reliable information? The way that we ensure that we're collecting all of the right information is by bringing everything together in an intentional way and ensuring that we can reconcile and that we can normalize and enrich everything in one location so that it can be pushed out everywhere else.
I think that's where Lansbury comes in and do the normalization and reconciliation, like you've shown us in the slides previously, where it brings in all the content and bring it into all the silo ones into one place where the intelligence come in and push to the other system where you can do informable, actionable insights. Right. Thank you for that, Thomas. We've got one from Anya. How do we balance the need for detailed asset discovery with concerns about performance, impact, and network overhead?
Um, I think this is a relatively straightforward one in the sense that if discovering something in your environment causes a performance impact or some kind of like additional network overhead, your discovery solution is not the right discovery solution. Um, you shouldn't be like identifying, in function of identifying things, you shouldn't be causing more things to break. It reminds me again, like when I was pen testing, and there's a port scanning tool called Nmap, and there was always these like anecdotal stories about running a port scan across an environment, like basically breaking the environment. And I always used to like almost like laugh at it, to be honest. And then one day I was in Abu Dhabi testing a bank, and I ran a port scan across the environment, and the entire environment like ceased to exist basically. And I was very embarrassed. The bank basically was down for a good few hours, but that was a port scan, right? If you are intentionally discovering stuff in your environment using a discovery product, it should not cause performance overhead. If you use a discovery product that does, I would look. I'm not here to sell anything. That's not my job. But I would recommend that you look at another discovery solution.
Cool. Thanks for that. I think that makes sense to me at least. I think that is some I appreciate your honest answer there. Um, I've got one for Halo, but I'm literally going through the quick answer now. But I've got another one that's quite interesting. What are some practical ways to consolidate multiple sources of asset data into a single reliable view within existing ITSM and or ESM workflows while ensuring data accuracy and knowing which attributes from each source to trust? I think there's twofold to that. So, Thomas, do you want to go first, and I can add my insights onto there as well?
Yeah, for me, like this question, like screams to the heart of what we're trying to achieve with technology asset intelligence. So, like at its core, we are trying to consolidate multiple sources of data into a single reliable. We use the word single source of truth, which sometimes feels a little bit too like marketing heavy, but it's true. That's like what we're driving towards, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that I'll say is that it's all well and good like bringing the data together, um, even in an intentional way, even if you can, reconcile and get rid of duplicates and all this kind of thing. But it is also important to be able to use that data as well. So, like, we've spent and invested a lot of time recently on building like BI dashboards into Lansweeper. We've spent a lot of time and effort on workflow automations as well. So it's not just about like how you bring them to data, it's about how you use that data to then go off and like make some decisions too, which then maybe to pump it into your ITSM or your ESM, which Jason, I guess you're going to cover off in your half of the question.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I think it's almost like looking at it in two folds. I'd often say having the truth and then having the support, right? Where Lansweeper can provide that normalization, consolidate data, and turn it into intelligence, right? This is the whole point of this webinar. Turn that having that intelligence into your ITSM platform essentially is almost like AI, but a different AI, automated intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, right? You automated discovery of these data, consolidate them together, turn them into intelligence, push it into your Halo ITSM platform. There you go. There you have your data-driven approach, and you can rely on those data because you trust these data. You know the quality of these data is accurate, then allows you to actually make an informed decision where there's no argument, there's no because it's all data-driven. And allowing having these data as well, it allows Halo to have more leverage on what we can do in from an automated process or from an automation perspective. Because the more data we have, the more data we can leverage and use. And exactly this is where Lansweeper and Halo comes together to become a really, really powerful solution. Um, I think I think that covers most of it. I do notice we're running out of time, but we have one last one. So Thomas, if you're happy to cover this as well, it'll be appreciated.
Yeah, the
Uh,
question. Oh, I think that's your. You said the question.
if we wanted to export the result data to less Tableau, less to create our own insights, do you have APIs that give access to this data?
Yeah, so um, just a slight step back. The way that like we integrate with other platforms, there's a few ways. We have like inherent like integration, so you can go into a marketplace and choose. So as an example, we have integrations with 60 different vendors in that particular manner, including Halo, obviously. Um, Tableau actually isn't one of the integrations that we've got, but what we also have is like a fully spec like open like API, which you can use. Um, Interesting that you mentioned Tableau because actually the majority of people who want to like dashboard externally out of Lansweeper are using Power BI, but obviously if your business has procured Tableau, then you sure as hell need to use it because from what I understand is it can be quite expensive. So yeah, in short, yes, we have APIs. You can pull all the data out. However, if you think like an integration be useful and there's a correlation between other people asking for Tableau too, then that would be fine. And as I mentioned a second ago, we also are in like preview, and by the end of the year it will be out. Have our own BI solution where you can do stuff within Lansweeper and share those insights and those charts and graphs, etc., with others as well.
is interesting because we're also working with Lansweeper to go through our sort of renewing our integration piece and have more functionality develop in the future. Um, Part of it, obviously, all the data available now is already going into the Halo database, which means that, and Halo has a full open API, REST API, so that can be integrated into your Tableau as well. So depending on the actual requirements or the actual sort of ecosystem we've got internally, that will determine the solution way or the way to push these data out. Um, Amazing. Thanks for that, Thomas. I think it was very beneficial. There's a lot for our customers to chew on. For those who are interested in more of an in-depth conversation or a demo, please feel free or do not hesitate to contact your customer success manager. Um, we're more than welcome to show you around and connect you guys with what we call technology asset intelligence, because that's where we really believe in having a joint solution that power our enterprise service management community. Thanks again, Thomas. That was very, very helpful and in depth. Hopefully we can do more of these soon.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks a lot, Jason, and thanks for everybody attending.
Thanks, everyone.